of a story format, so it's easier to do while I'm driving. So, how do you determine where and with whom to give birth once you get to that point? This is probably a decision that not a lot of people think about, but it's also a very important one because it determines a lot, or can determine a lot of how your pregnancy and your birth experience go. Birth is something that should be experienced and should not just happen. And with that in mind, it's important to know who you are giving birth with and where, and the environment they're going to set, and the expectations that they set, because that will determine what you are allowed to do during birth, what is normal for them during birth. It will determine how your birth goes, honestly, and what interventions you're likely to encounter, if any. So with my daughter, I did not think about this at all. I just went with the local hospital. That's what people did. That's what I did. After I had done a whole lot of healing from her birth, because her birth did not go as expected and ended up in an emergency C-section with a lot of trauma attached to it. So after I had done a lot of healing, I got pregnant with my son, and we wanted to do it differently. I knew deep down that if I wanted to have a natural birth, I could not be in a hospital setting, because just taking my daughter to the clinic for her well child visits would start to raise my blood pressure and put me on edge. And I could feel that before I was even pregnant. I'm like, and it's not going to get any better when you're in pregnancy and in labor. You need calm, especially if there's trauma involved. You need someplace you're calm and comfortable to give birth naturally. So, I had found out that I was pregnant right during harvest. And wanting to do this decision with my husband, we decided to just kind of wait. We weren't in any hurry, honestly. I had a lot of peace that I did with his pregnancy that I did not have with my daughter's. And we just decided to wait, honestly. I did research. I Googled a lot. I talked to a lot of different people and got recommendations, who they liked, who they didn't like. And then after I got a couple names, I Google stalked them. I wanted to know their past history, their experience. I wanted to know reviews, anything, legal cases against them, any legal documents, everything. I wanted to know it up front. I wanted to know their past education history, what birth experiences did they tend to attend? Were they mostly hospital? Were they home? Were they birth center? How many interventions did they use? What was their kind of philosophy? And I tried to gather a lot of that before we even started interviewing. So after all of that, I got it narrowed down to 2 midwives. We chose to go with midwives because in my state, doctors are not allowed outside of the hospital. And honestly, certified nurse midwives, nurse being the key, is not allowed outside of a birth center or hospital either. So we found 2 midwives, and one was a certified nurse midwife, one was not. They're called a lay midwife, or a direct entry midwife is the other term, meaning they have not went to medical school. And I had come up with a list that was probably pages long of questions for each of them. We interviewed the first midwife, asked her all the questions, and those questions ranged from birth experiences, education, what was typical, what was expected at prenatal visits, what was, as far as procedures or tests, What was expected during labor? Like, could you eat or drink? Was there certain, like, did you have to be hooked to an IV if I was in a birth center? Or what was allowed, what was not allowed, what was expected? And then I even asked the tougher questions of their personal records, transfer rates, emergency rates, VBAC success rates, because that's what I would have been, was a VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean. How many mothers have you lost? How many babies have you lost? And good midwives will not hide that. The fact of it is, if you are in birth long enough, you're gonna lose somebody at some point. Some of them are preventable, some of them aren't. And that's just the way it is. Doctors lose them all the time, even with all their technology. What I found is actually midwives a lot of times have better rates than the doctors. I asked about intervention rates, what to do with specific things I was concerned about, which at that time was preeclampsia. What do you recommend during pregnancy to prevent it, if there is anything? What added complications I was going to add, or procedures that I would have to undergo during pregnancy. So all these questions I asked them, like, it took probably a good hour to get through all of the questions. But what it gave me was a good feeling of their philosophy, a good understanding of where they came from, their background, and how they operated. So we got to the end of all the interviewing, and I wanted one midwife, my husband wanted the other. And a lot of it was comfort level of where to give birth. The one midwife that my husband wanted happened to be at a birth center, but because of the policy of the physicians they work under, I would have to give birth in a hospital because I had had a C-section, and I was not comfortable with that at all, which is what really the main reason, like, I did not want that midwife, is I did not want to give birth in a hospital. But we agreed to tour the facility and look it over, see how it is, because we knew it was totally different than the facility I gave birth at, or the hospital I gave birth at with my daughter. Went through it. My husband could not attend the tour with me. We had to schedule it, and he was busy. So I wound up going with my daughter alone, and I made it through most of it. But as we got further and further into the labor and delivery wards, I started to have anxiety. And I should back up a little bit. I'm sorry for the road noise. But prior to this, I had prayed very specifically for probably at least a week that God... There it is. Alright. Problems with doing this on the road. So we're going to try and wrap this up. I had prayed very specifically that God would give me very clear answers. I didn't want anything gray. I wanted black and I wanted white. That way there was no doubt in my mind that we were on the right path. So prior to the hospital visit, I prayed for complete peace if this is where we were supposed to give birth. And if it was not, I wanted a complete anxiety attack. I have only ever had one other anxiety attack up to this point in my life. So I knew a little bit about what it was, or at least my version of it. And so I wanted something very clear. So we made it through most of it, and as we got into the labor and delivery rooms, I just started getting more and more anxious. I could feel it. I could feel the tension building, and I started to turn my focus towards my daughter. Like, I couldn't even listen to the tour guide anymore at that point. Like, I just needed to focus on one thing to keep me from completely losing it. So when she became my focus, we got out of there and headed to the car as fast as I possibly could. This was in December, so we had to get coats on, and trying to get a coat on a 2-year-old who did not want to get in the car or put her coat on. She wasn't done having fun. I'm in the middle of anxiety, like attack, melting down, trying to get her to the car across the parking garage. Finally get into the car, get her buckled, get me buckled, lock the doors. Like, okay, now I can like completely let go and melt down. I called my husband in complete tears and sobs, barely able to talk, and said, I can't do this. Like, I cannot give birth here. And he says, that's okay. You tried. We have our answer. And I called the other midwife and scheduled her. And that's how we decided where we were going to give birth with my son. It did wind up being at home. And that's okay. It led to a very redemptive birth that I would not have had in a hospital. As we finished his birth, or as I was in labor with him, it was a very long labor, and if we would have been in a hospital, I wouldn't have been able to do it, because I would have been labeled as failure to progress. He would have been labeled as stuck. I would have been labeled with too small of a pelvis, and he would have been labeled too big. I'm a smaller female. He was over 9 pounds. A very, very large baby. But because I'm able to relax and take it at my own pace, I was able to have him at home. And that was very redemptive for me, because it proved to me and myself, which is what I needed and God knew I needed, that my body was capable. So I hope this helps you. It does not necessarily mean it's the only way. It's not for everybody. But the biggest key